Good evening, everyone. My name is Esther-Miriam Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Woolf Institute, and I would like to welcome you all to this book launch webinar that will celebrate Christopher Clohessy's latest book, Angels Hastening. And this event is brought to you through collaboration of various institutions, the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, Gorgias Press, and then last but not least, the Hikmah Foundation. Having Father Clohessy here with us is actually rather wonderful because the first event that we ever did with the Hikmah Foundation in Cambridge was involving Father Clohessy. So it's really, really wonderful to have him here again at this webinar. I can see by the names that are appearing as attendees that we have quite a few members in the audience, in the webinar audience, who have joined us for other webinars. But for those of you who have never been to one of our webinars, the Woolf Institute is a research institution in Cambridge. We focus on religion and society. We combine our research with all sorts of outreach and public education activities. So please do have a look at our website, have a look at our podcasts and videos to see our work. The welcome committee that we have here together to celebrate Father Clohessy's book is quite intense. So I don't want to sort of draw this introduction out too long, but just very, very quickly explain the setup of this webinar. We are having 4 or so introductory speakers. Then we have Father Clohessy's presentation of about 30 minutes. And in the end, you will be able to ask questions. Please put your questions in the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, because then it's easier for us to manage the questions in the end. So without further ado, I am handing over to Gemma Tully from Gorgias Press, who is the brains behind this book launch. Gemma.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Well, it's lovely to be here. So as Miriam said, I am Gemma. I am a representative of Gorgias Press, and we are the publisher fortunate enough to represent Father Clohessy's award-winning scholarship. Now, if you don't know about Gorgias, we were founded in 2001. We're an independent publisher of books and journals in history, languages, and religious studies. And our specific subject areas include biblical studies, Syriac and Eastern Christianity, Jewish studies, Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, language and linguistics, the ancient Near East, archaeology, and history. So lots of fantastic subjects there. We're delighted to be part of today's launch, and would particularly like to thank Dr. Wagner from the Woolf for hosting the event, as well as Dr. Welle, Director of PISAI, and the Hikmah Foundation for their support, special guest, Dr. Nakshawani, and of course, Father Clohessy for making this possible. But we want to say thank you to you too, everyone that's attended. So Gorgias is delighted to be able to offer everyone attending today 40% off Angels Hastening. I'll put the coupon code and all the information you need in the chat box. So thank you again. And now I'll hand over to Dr. Welle.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Rome. Assalamu alaikum to all of our brothers and sisters following this event from many different places. It brings me great joy to say a word of introduction about Professor Christopher Clohessy, extraordinary professor at the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, PISAI, where I currently serve as Director of Studies. PISAI was founded by the Society of the Missionaries of Africa, the White Fathers, as they're commonly known, as a study and research center whose teaching and scientific activities provide the necessary preparation for an informed theological dialogue with Islam. The institute was founded in Tunisia almost a century ago with a different name, but has been located in Rome since 1964. We offer 2 academic degrees, the licentiate and the doctorate in Arabic and Islamic studies, both based on the in-depth study of the Arabic language as a necessary tool which enables access to the fundamental texts of Islam. Our students come from every part of the world, and many of them become actively involved after their study in direct or indirect contacts with the Muslim community. And this afternoon, we will hear from one of our professors, but not just a professor, a former student of the Institute. It's always a joy when someone studies at a place and has a wonderful experience there and wants to come back and teach. So in this case, Professor Clohessy earned his licentiate here in 2001. his doctorate here in 2006, and in 2015 returned as a full-time member of our teaching faculty. Professor Clohessy presents the type of research that should characterize our professors and our students. Close and careful analysis of texts in the source languages, attention to the top modern critical scholarship of those same texts, and a sincere desire to bring the fruits of this research into an informed theological dialogue with Muslims, which Professor Clohessy frequently does through his contacts in the Shia community. His passionate interest, and I choose the adjective passionate in light of Karbalā, his passionate interest in Shi'i Islam is well known in our academic community. And I assure our Shi'i brothers and sisters that he effectively communicates this enthusiasm to our students. Again and again, when Professor Clohessy and I sit together on commissions for comprehensive oral exams, if the student has the chance to choose the question, they always want to talk about the Shia. And I take this not as an indictment of my own work, inshallah, but as a sign of the seriousness and personal investment that Professor Clohessy manifests in his research and teaching. Many who are following this webinar have seen this scholarly rigor in his prior monographs on Fatima and on Zainab, books for which the Republic of Iran recently awarded him, recently named him Distinguished Researcher of Shia Studies in their 28th World Book Award. And shortly we will hear about his most recent monograph on the dreams of Karbalā. Let me note in conclusion that I find the date of this event very fitting. Roman Catholics today celebrate the solemnity of the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel announced to the Virgin Mary that through God's intervention, she would give birth to Jesus, a narrative presented with a number of remarkable similarities in the Gospel of Luke and in the Quran. We shall listen to Professor Clohessy discuss a different kind of angelic intervention, the dreams of Karbalā, in which heavenly visitors inform women and men about events to come. And so I shall bring my comments to a conclusion, knowing that in the matter of angelic intervention, it is better to listen than to speak. And so I welcome the words of Dr. Sayyid Nakshawani, followed by those of my colleague and friend, Reverend Dr. Christopher Clohessy.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Thank you all so much. I thought that the works on Fatima and Zainab were fascinating. And now I just finished reading another, I would say, groundbreaking work. Because I think hither to this point, a lot of the discussions concerning Karbalā were discussions which centered around what took place in and around the 10th of Muharram, and did not necessarily look at the discussions of Karbalā many years before Karbalā and the Battle of Karbalā had taken place. And so this is groundbreaking because it offers us insight into discussions concerning the tragedy of Karbalā, maybe up to 50 years before the tragedy even happens. And therefore, I cannot, in reality, do justice to the wonderful research that has taken place by Father Clohessy, with any words to describe the meticulous depth in which he has looked at literature. The first point of the literature, which I feel is of the utmost importance, is that he tries to show in this work that it's not only Shia literature that discusses the relationship between the Prophet Muhammad and his grandson Hussein. He uses a number of non-Shia sources to highlight that Hussein doesn't necessarily just belong to one group or one sect, but that rather everybody has a narrative concerning Hussein. If you look at some of the sources that are being used, these are sources from the Abbasid period, in some cases later. And a lot of these sources are sources which are not necessarily associated with Shi'i scholars. And yet he shows that even in these sources, the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, those who surround the Prophet Muhammad, and even all the way until Umayyad caliphs who lived after Karbala, discuss what is about to happen to Hussein, discuss the tragedy of Karbala, discuss the beheading of Karbala. So I think, on the first level, you've got the groundbreaking discussion of Imam al-Hussein, Karbala, but from the angle which is not normally seen, and that is the non-Shi'i sources that discuss Karbala. There are, of course, a great number of Shi'i sources which he employs in discussing Karbala and discussing the dreams that relate to Karbala. And that brings me on to the second point, which I find of the utmost importance, and that is this comparison between dreams in the Bible and dreams in the Quran. There are those who've had dreams that become reality. They are prophecies. They're giving us an indication of a monumental event that's about to occur, as can be seen, for example, in the lives of Moses or the lives of Joseph. And he wonderfully shows how this also continues in the life of the Prophet Muhammad as well, where he witnesses or he sees these dreams. And I say witnesses or sees because there's this wonderful discussion about the difference between manam, hilm, and ru'ya. All of them in English are normally translated as dreams. And Father Clohessy tries to show the difference between the three. And he allows us to explore certain personalities who aren't really mentioned so much, the likes of Fadl, Ayman, Salama, and others who talk about Karbala and show a third aspect, which I think is very important. And he's going to elaborate on this further. And that is how mourning is part and parcel of the prophetic message. What can be seen in the Bible and discussing the mourning that is associated with certain prophetic figures and with the children of Israel can be seen with the Prophet Muhammad as well. The Prophet Muhammad is emotional. There is a lot of emotion surrounding his family. There's emotion with those who hear about Hussein and what's about to happen to Hussein. And instead of looking negatively at mourning, there is this discussion within the sources that mourning can actually be something that allows for the growth of the human being. There are many non-Muslims who cannot understand why the Shia mourn Hussein every year. What Father Clohessy shows was that possibly is what the Prophet Muhammad envisaged, wanted, and felt would be fundamental in them understanding the emotional aspects of the prophetic message. So not only do you have discussions concerning Sunni and Shia literature, a comparison between biblical and Quranic literature and Hadith literature, but you've also got this very human touch, which otherwise is very much or rarely discussed. And so I'd like to pass it over to the main man himself for him to elaborate further on this wonderful text. Thank you.
So it was on an autumn night in Medina in the year 680, 61st year of Hijrah, same night on which Al-Hussein was killed, that Salama, who is the last surviving widow of Muhammad, and Muhammad by this time has been dead almost half a century, Salama, a woman deep into her 80s, is torn from her sleep by this apparition of her late husband, Prophet of Islam. And at that moment, she slips effortlessly into an array of Muslims who, irrespective of their gender or their status or their level of taqwa, which is the ethical mark of true Islamic faith, were the recipients of somber and frightening dreams by night, but sometimes even by day. At the heart of these enigmatic dreams, populated by angels in a hurry, or by the jinn grieving, textured with Iraqi dust and the blood of martyrs, was of course the event of Karbala. And Salama's vision would find its way into a variety of texts, not only texts of hadith and theology, but also the biographies of whole cities and peoples, chronicled by some of those untiring historians like the Syrian Ibn Asakir. That is perhaps, let us say, the first fundamental subtext of this work, that we should not be surprised to find serious historians, Sunni and Shia alike, portraying angelic visions and predictive dreams with all the same earnestness with which they portray battles and lives and deaths as eyewitness history. When Islam erupted into the worlds of Judaism and Christianity, it carried with it something that the Jewish and Christian communities already took for granted, that in the great monotheistic faith traditions, religious and secular history are inextricably bound, running without any contention along almost parallel lines. For the secular historian, there may be no such objective reality as sacred history. It has no obvious significance for secular history, except insofar as secular history is affected by the way that religious groups or religious movements impact upon or modify the course of events. But for the believer, Jewish or Christian or Muslim, secular and sacred history journey together, because the sacred is understood as the frequent interventions of God's eruptive voice into the world, a collection of divine responses to earthly events, so that mainstream monotheists regard particular religious events as historical occurrences, backed up at the very least by eyewitness accounts, or maybe by stark symbols like empty tombs. So whether it be the conferral of the Sinai covenant, or the Last Supper with Jesus and the 12, or the birth of Imam Ali in the Kaaba, we are bound to read these sacred texts not just academically, but also according to the understanding of the religious reader, how that text forges and informs and persuades faith. And that is how I have attempted to read these dream texts. It's hardly surprising that historians like Ibn Asakir and Ibn Kathir should include angelic mediation in their histories. As one scholar noted, the objective truth of the information given in the dreams or given by the angel is unquestioned. The dream or the angelic message has a clear meaning. After all, the prophets themselves considered dreams as revelation to them of sacred law. The second, or a second, fundamental subtext, and I think it's essential to this blending of secular and sacred history, is the at times startlingly animated angelic presence in these dreams. Of all the questions you might want to ask about angels, writes one poet, the only one you ever hear is how many can dance on the head of a pin. No curiosity about how they pass eternal time. But Islam penetrated a world of Christian shrines and places of worship that were much devoted, attached to ideas, not all of them orthodox, of this tangible angelic presence, and dedicated to honoring these heavenly beings who toil and intercede on humanity's behalf. In the Islamic body of texts, there is substantially less written about angels in their function and in their nature. But even the relative scarcity of Islamic texts about angels does not belie the fact that as Islamic scholars observe often enough, angels are, in contraposition to other monotheistic faith traditions, indispensable to Islamic belief. They appear second in the list of Islamic creedal articles. So that the lack of a written angelology in Islam is possibly the result of the considerable Islamic emphasis on revelation, because the chief importance of angels is their function rather than their nature. And while this may be equally so in Christianity and Judaism, ultimately angels are for Islam a more essential ingredient to that divine intervention that we call revelation than they are for Judaism or for Christianity. And the third fundamental subtext of this book is that of dreams. As Sayyid pointed out, the Quran uses these three discrete expressions for dreams: the word ru'ya and the word manam, although sometimes manam in the Quranic text means simply sleep, and at other times dream. And then, of course, the term hulm, with its plural form ahlam, generally refers to bad dreams or dreams that have a bad symbolism. Comparable to angels, dreams, at least in the Islamic ambit, enfold themselves virtually seamlessly into almost every aspect of Islamic human life. And again, comparable to angels, they appear to perform similar functions, sometimes warning, sometimes chastising, now commiserating, now commending, at other times informing or commanding. Some scholars would suggest that it was the very dreams and visions of the Prophet Muhammad that announced the beginnings of historical Islam, so that the Quran itself may be classified as a visionary text. But in antithesis to the question of angels, in the case of dream interpretation, the Islamic writings are substantially more than those of the Jewish and Christian scholars. We are in possession of the names of countless Muslim thinkers and scholars who, intrigued by the role of dreams, found themselves dabbling in analysis, clarification. Ibn Sirin was ostensibly, although probably erroneously, regarded as the father of Islamic dream interpretation, notwithstanding the fulsome praise given him by Ibn Khaldun, notwithstanding Bukhari actually transmitting from him this threefold classification of dreams, notwithstanding the texts attributed to him, he is judged to be inauthentic in most of the writings we have. But Ibn Sirin is only one of an extensive but not exhaustive list enumerated by a scholar called Al-Khalal in his list of dream interpreters, Tabaqat al-Mu'abbirin. And other dream interpreters include Kermani, whose manual of the meanings of dreams we have, but only in small fragments, and Ibn Qutayba, who was probably the first compiler of a dream text that is still extant, and Sijistani, among others. So Islam is not short of men and women who probe the meanings of dreams. And it's an art that is seemingly as prevalent now as it was when Al-Khalal compiled his long list of dream interpreters. But while the dream of someone like Sulaiman bin Abdul Malik bin Marwan, with whose dream the book begins, needed the interpretation of somebody, so that he summoned the mystic Al-Hasan al-Basri. And while the dream of al-Fadl called for clarification by the Prophet Muhammad himself, the majority of dreams about Al-Hussein's death at Karbala are almost never enigmatic or impenetrable, almost never possessed of a symbolism that demands to be disentangled by some sophisticated explanation. They are instead characterized by a stark and unmitigated clarity. It was standing before Yazid bin Muawiyah that Zainab, sometimes called the tongue of Ali in pursuit, in homage to her oratorical skills that she inherited from her father, began the great oral tradition that surrounds Karbala. However, the event would also be inscribed into a sort of communal unforgetfulness, a communal anamnesis by all of those people who passed a variety of dreams down to the succeeding generations. As they progress, as narrated in this book, these Karbalā dream narratives that are peopled by a variety of characters begin to take on a more vivid and a more increasing detail. The dust, for example, which begins as nothing more than a sign of bitter sadness on the head and the beard of Muhammad, will eventually become the dust that he holds in his hand and turns over and over again as he mourns the future death of his grandson. Eventually, it will be given shape and texture and color and even odor. It will become a clod of earth, or it will become mud or dust that is vibrantly red in color. Ultimately, it will become dust in a small glass tube or vial that is placed under Salama's guardianship, and which on a day, at an hour, will turn into blood. There's also a development not only in the character of this visiting angel, but also in the words and the gestures that this celestial visitor uses. But this angel, if indeed Gibril is an angel, fortuitously shared as he is by monotheistic faiths, this angel is harder to delineate than the dust, for example. In the stories of the predictions of Al-Hussein's death, it is quite clearly Gibril who takes a singular role, performing these distinct gestures in order to retrieve a handful of dust from the Karbalā plain, either beating the ground with his hand or his fist or his wing to produce red mud, or extending his hand or reaching into Karbalā at great distance to seize a handful of its dust, or just expanding his wing. Gibril dominates this book, but it's hard to put a finger on what or who Gibril actually is. He's only named 3 times in the Quran. And I know that the Sunni texts of Hadith provide a very dissimilar, at times inconsistent picture of this Gibril. Certainly, Gibril is seen, we are told, by the Prophet Muhammad at least twice in his original created form, at least so insists Aisha, covered with 600 wings. At times, he occupies this great seat or this throne between heaven and earth, his massive bulk filling that space. More than once, Aisha describes the mechanics of revelation, but she never ever gives us a description of the being who brought it from heaven. At other times, the Prophet Muhammad sees Gibril as a man, not only in his heart, as some texts suggest, because there are enough narratives to tell us that it was more than just in his heart. At the famous Battle of the Trench, for example, in the year 627, Gibril appears as a soldier, described by the texts as nonchalantly brushing dust from his hair. Other people don't see him, causing Aisha to remark to Muhammad, "You see what we do not see," while Salama and Ibn Abbas, as noted in the book, do see him, but they are fooled into thinking that Gibril is in fact someone else, thinking that he is a companion of Muhammad named Dihya bin Khalifa al-Kalbi. The famous Hadith Gibril asserts that a number of Muhammad's companions see Gibril, but they think he is a man dressed in a radiant white garment with pitch black hair, a traveler, although curiously showing none of the weariness of travel, and who then, having explained the fundamentals of Islam, disappears from their sight. Gibril is also seen by a man called Sa'd, who is fighting alongside the Prophet at the Battle of Uhud in 625, in the same way that Ibn Abbas would see him, as a man dressed in white, standing by the Prophet. Another companion by the name of Abu Dhar hears a voice that turns out to be the voice of Gibril, the same voice that will be heard by Hagar, mother of Ismail, as she frantically searches for water in the desert, although other texts tell us that Abu Dhar heard no such thing. The word spirit, ruh, occurs 21 times in the Quranic text. Generally, most classical commentators identify the spirit with Gibril, and Gibril with this angelic being who descended with revelation, although the text of the Quran itself doesn't actually insist upon this identification. The Quran, in fact, never calls Gibril an angel and never actually calls Gibril a spirit, referring rather to the spirit of God, which is interpreted to be Gibril. The drawback, of course, with the word spirit, especially if in translation it is capitalized, is that it carries behind it the weight of Christian pneumatology. If it's not capitalized, the word spirit could easily, justifiably refer to an angel, remembering that the word angel refers to function rather than to nature, even to an angelic rank, so that Gibril might be, in fact, an angel who has a rank unique amongst the others. So the Quran never actually designates Gibril as angel. It implies, however, that his status and his function are different, and it's in the later texts of Hadith that this supernatural being, this bringer down of revelation, begins to be called angel. In Al-Hussein's case, unlike that of Surat Maryam, where a group of angels makes the announcement, at least in one of the texts, of the birth of Isa, in the case of Al-Hussein's death, it is always one angel, always clearly identified, either by name, Gibril, or by title, such as the angel of the rain, or by some distinguishing characteristic, such as being described as an angel who has never descended before. It would be hard for us to conclude that Muhammad's experiences recounted in these dream texts were not visual, but auditory. The language that is used, the physicality expressed, such as Gibril beating the ground or handing him the dust of Karbalā, suggests the opposite, that Muhammad actually saw Gibril, perhaps in a simple, unusual, anthropomorphic form. He did, after all, have functional wings, which he used to produce dust from Karbalā, while the others involved in the story, like Salama, did not see him. Even Al-Hussein rarely, if ever, expresses any childhood memories of actually seeing his grandfather's celestial visitor, although as a boy he is present when these visitations occur. Seldom does anyone besides the Prophet see the heavenly messenger, even among those present at the time of the visitation. In one dream, Muhammad's daughter Fatima has a tactile experience of her heavenly visitors, but it is not confirmed that she actually saw them as they really were. The conversation that takes place between the Prophet and the angel who stands before him grows in emotion and in intensity, with the Prophet intermittently taking the lead in the conversation. In the early accounts, he is nothing more than a silent recipient of very bad news. Then he begins to express a wish to know the identity of the future killers of his grandson, who will be members of his own ummah, his own community. Eventually, he asks to be shown the place, or at least the dust of the place where his grandson will die. Slowly, therefore, the reader of these accounts becomes aware of the land of Karbalā, which at first is described very hesitantly, only by certain physical elements. In a very early text from Al-Khawarizmi and another from Ibn Tawus, Muhammad is shown Al-Hussein's future tomb, but more frequently it is red dust or soil by which Al-Hussein's place of martyrdom is depicted. Sequentially, it is pinpointed more exactly, rather than remaining a place where he will die or a place from which Gibril retrieves dust, and it's named by its description as a land of distress, karb, and tribulation, wabballah. At its deepest level, beyond all the details of bloodied soil and of the air pulsating with angels' wings, beyond the flurry of angelic movement and Salama's ineffectual attempts to guard the door of the house, beyond the proposition of the Husseinian model as an indictment of iniquity and a paradigm of resistance against injustice, these reports for me detail the manner in which a particular group of people encountered the divine. After all, the whole Islamic ethic roots itself in the conviction that the most elemental relationship in life is the relationship with God. I know that one might be tempted to think that these accounts of Al-Hussein are merely an attempt by some Shi'i scholars to give angelic endorsement to the drama of his martyrdom. But in fact, outside of the body of Shi'i hadith and history, these accounts are quite patently found in the works of non-Shi'i scholars. Nor are these angelic messages about Hussein necessarily a later addition. In the 8th century, second Islamic century, Ibn Tahman is only one of a group of scholars already alluding to them 100 years before At-Tirmidhi. Even if, as we noted at the start, or as I note at the start of the book, even if we were to choose to follow a substantially large number of non-Muslim academics and regard large parts of the corpus of hadith as unreliable, we still have to deal with these stories in a basic narrative form in the most important of the Islamic historians, most of whom are Sunni, so that these reports must be regarded as more than just a Shi'i reading of history or an attempt at divine endorsement. Aside from purely academic motives, we have to read these texts about al-Hussein, not specifically of Karbalā, which easily finds its way into secular history, but the angelic announcements of his death in the same way that religious people read them. I know that critical textual analysis forms a substantial and crucial part of academic life, but it is not the only or even the primary reason for reading and appreciating a text. If we only read Hafiz or Rumi or Dante for the purpose of critical analysis, we should fail to appreciate the cadences of great literature. The dream of Salama on the night of Karbalā, of a long dead Muhammad sorrowing over his grandson's death, a dream that tore her from her sleep just in time to hear a distant lament of the jinn, those sometimes playful, sometimes malevolent spirits that interfere with human life. The dream of Salama was just one of a series of predictions, both pre and post Karbalā, which now form an indistinguishable echo that resonates through these texts of medieval Sunni and Shi'i Islam. In a religious tradition which easily embraces secular and sacred history as running together, angelic visitations, predictive dreams, distressing visions form as regular a part of Islamic historical discourse as do any other more easily classifiable eyewitness events. This book, Angels Hastening, the Karbalā Dreams, and the first part of the title is taken from one of the verses of Surat An-Nazi'at, chapter 79 of the Quran, translated by Pictol as Angels in a Hurry or Angels Hastening. This book is a foray into classical and medieval dream texts. I've used the primary Arabic sources, tracing especially the predictive visions, starting before Al-Hussein is born, which augur his death on the field of Karbalā in dreams and apparitions that are full of Iraqi dust and Al-Hussein's blood, full of angels in a hurry, full of the wailing of the jinn, and culminating in this famous and beautiful Hadith al-Qarura, the tradition of the glass tube or the glass vial, a vial which is going to be safeguarded by the faithful Salama, and which contains dust from Karbalā, which will turn to blood on the night of Ashura. And finally, the dreams transform into more ominous warnings, visited upon a variety of people, tradesmen, soldiers, and just camp followers, threatening dire punishment awaiting those who, even by their mere presence, supported the killing of the third Imam. I have attempted in this work to recount part of the Karbalā narrative that is very rarely told outside of traditional majlis or ta'ziyah settings, opening it perhaps to a wider, more diverse readership, an element of a battle that has left this ineffaceable mark on the Islamic world, a mark that is perpetually engraved upon the memories of those devoted to Al-Hussein. Karbalā is the place where the Shi'i heart lies, the place where the Shi'i heart beats, because it's the place where Al-Hussein's heart beats, the place where the Shi'i heart breaks, because it is the place where Al-Hussein's heart breaks. An example that drives them to be more engaged with justice, to stand before iniquity with such sadness and goads them into actions. It may well be that Zainab, who spoke with her father's tongue, began the great oral tradition of Karbalā, But I would say that the event would be no less inscribed into a communal remembrance, a tenacious unforgetfulness by those who passed down to succeeding generations the dreams and the visions of this book. This short work, then, is an attempt to read again the text of encounters between humans and the divine, to catch the strains of an authentic angelic voice coming down to us through the years as fresh as it was when it rang out in the house of Salama. One final point. A woman, Salama, stands at the heart of this work. In fact, women stand at the heart of all the works I have managed to produce. Of all the people I must and will thank, 3 women stand out. Gemma, of course, with her untiring ability to multitask, even in lockdown. And then a great scholar, Yasmin Amin, who is probably somewhere in Egypt right now, but whose superb lecture on this subject in London a few years ago caused me to sit up and pay great attention. And Berenice, whose dogged proofreading and correction of my grammar has been done with such generosity of time. Thank you to them. Thank you all, especially Miriam, the Woolf Institute, Ammar, in whose honor I have placed behind us copies of Bihar Anwar, Jason for being part of this presentation, and thank you all who have joined us for this time together.
Thank you very much, Father Clohessy. This was very, very nice, very interesting. If you have any questions to the author, please put them now into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure you have some things you would like to ask Father Clohessy. And while you type or think, perhaps we can start off here in the panel of people that are in the webinar. My question is, what prompted you? Do you yourself experience similar dreams like this? Is this what attracted you to this topic?
No, I wish I had dreams of angels, not me. I was writing, of course, the work on Lady Zainab. And while I was writing on Zainab and the work on Lady Fatima as well, I was collecting in a separate file these dream stories which kept reoccurring in the text and which provoked my interest. And then, as I said, in London a few years ago, Yasmin gave a lecture specifically on the Hadith al-Qarura, the tradition of this glass vial, which I found fascinating. She very kindly and generously gave me her text. I had to avoid plagiarism at great cost, but it was because of that, and as well as the fact that I'd already come upon these texts and was interested by them, because I like the idea of angels, but I also like the idea of dreams and their interpretation, that I put this work together. So it was a task that filled me with great pleasure, and I hope that people who read it are filled with as much pleasure as I was filled with as I researched and wrote it.
We have a audience, we have a raised hand, but oh yeah, it's coming up actually now in the Q&A. Yasmin Amin says, this is a masterful, engaging and passionate work. Thank you, truly wonderful. A question, if you kindly allow me. How do these accounts of dreams vary across time as the literature, oral in nature, progresses from history to mercantile, hard as it is to draw the line? For example, from the accounts Tabari collected to those of Ibn Shahar Ashhub or Ibn Tawus.
Thank you. Well, of course, I always use Tabari as a basis. I always begin with Tabari's account of history, although Tabari's details are very, very minimal in terms of dream encounters. In fact, he describes at great length Karbalā, eyewitness accounts of the battle, but very little in terms of dream encounters. But in other very, very early works, we have very, very basic ideas. For example, in Ibn Hanbal, we have, and Tirmidhi, we have these very simplistic, very basic narratives of a vision, perhaps, or a dream. Tirmidhi carefully avoids any mention of an angel, because he doesn't want us to think that this is Gibril bringing fresh revelation. Ibn Hanbal tells the story at least 3 times in his narrative, and changes slightly, but it's very simplistic. It's as the years go on that the dream details, such as the dust, such as the place of divine encounter, which eventually becomes the house of Salama, such as the emphasis on the tube, the glass vial, and such as the texture and the odor begin to be added by later medieval scholars, both Sunni and Shia alike. But the very early Sunni scholars, certainly like certainly Hanbal, but even Tirmidhi, certainly recount these, if not in a very simplistic form. I know that Yasmin, because Yasmin's lecture is the one I heard, she knows a great deal about the isnad of this tradition. In the Maqatil literature, the stories of the killing of al-Hussein, I found less evidence of these dreams. So, for example, the famous one of Khawarizmi, he certainly, again, he mentions these moments, these encounters, but with very little detail compared to some of the other non-literature about the actual death of al-Hussein. Ibn Asakir is the one who's most interesting of all, because he has a number of accounts of this dream, all of them slightly different, but Ibn Asakir was not known for his love of Shia Islam. And therefore he recounts these dreams really objectively as an historian and gives much more detail in terms of the angel, in terms of the Prophet weeping, in terms of Salama. So obviously, as with most Islamic traditions, as the time goes on, details are added in. But even in the very early texts, we already have the elements that are simply going to be expanded, and that is the dust, Muhammad sorrowing, Salama trying to guard the door of the house to stop the little boy al-Hussein from going in and interrupting the Prophet. The questions that the angel asks Muhammad, specifically the question, "Do you love him?" which begins the whole series. So there's obviously a development of detail as time goes on, both Sunni and Shia. But I'm always amazed that so many of the Shia writers have given fine detail in terms of the elements of the story. Maqatil literature less so. Surprisingly, one would expect that the literature that specifically details Karbala and the events of Karbala, one would expect that they would account for these dreams, but I don't remember Tabari doing so. Certainly Khawarizmi does in his Maqatil, in his Maqtal.
All right, we have another question from Roger Hickley, who's asking, is there any concept of a fallen angel, Lucifer, in Islam?
Yes, Roger, my good friend from Cape Town, there is certainly Shaitan, who begins with the name Iblis. It's an interesting name, Iblis. The root is Balasa, and it might well mean the one who has nothing to hope in or to hope for, the one who despairs. And Iblis, the fallen angel, whose story is told dramatically in the Quran, in a rather moving text in which God consults with the angels about whether he should create humans. They protest loudly, saying, "Don't do that, humans will be wicked, they will shed blood all over the earth." But God rejects the advice of the angels, creates human beings with free will, and invites the angels to prostrate before them. And there is one lone voice of dissent, and that is Iblis, the angel who says, "I will never bow before anything that is not God." So that in a sense, as the famous Sufi mystics have retranslated him, he becomes a monotheist who is too perfect in his monotheism, who refuses a divine command because it goes against his monotheism, and then falls, of course, from grace and from God. So Shaitan is a prominent character in Islamic theology and in Quranic texts. He stalks people's lives, he stalks through this world, and provides many dangers that have to be avoided. So we certainly have in Islam the concept of a fallen angel who is given much more detail in the Quranic text than the counterpart, if you like, Satan, is given in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures.
We have quite a few questions pouring in, so I'll read this quickly. There's a question from Sama. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and for your kind words, and a nod to my presentation. I appreciate this book in particular among all your works. My question is whether the figure of the Prophet's grandchildren can bridge the divide between Sunnis and Shia in other areas by focusing on the commonalities rather than the differences, especially the dramatic events of Kabbalah and the injustice, but also their interests and sacrifice?
Well, that's a really difficult question, and it's not the first time I've been asked this question in recent weeks. I was asked the same question, almost the same question, with the Pope's visit to Iraq, and most especially with his visit to Najaf. I think that, and I've always thought, that Al-Hussein is one of those religious characters who in fact transcends the boundaries of culture and religion, transcends the boundaries of text, transcends the boundaries of language. And he becomes this figure of a courageous stand for justice, for truth and for justice. You know, the concept being that if you want peace, you have to create justice or work for justice. And sometimes you have to wage justice and wage peace. So in Al-Hussein, for myself as an outsider of this religious tradition of Islam, we have a perfect example of somebody who saw something that he regarded as shameful and wrong and as distorting an injustice, and he took a firm stand in desiring to put it right at the cost of his life. And he is followed really by all the members of the family of the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, in taking this stand and being killed for it, not only in Shia Islam. In Sunni Islam, there have been many who have given their lives for the sake of God, if you like, or in the way, fi sabilillah, in the way of God. So I think that if we visualize or envision Al-Hussein not as belonging to one particular group in Islam, but as a universal figure, then he could become a bridge, not only he, but others too, could become a bridge between a gap that is very difficult to bridge. He might be one of those who is able to do it. I thought that perhaps that just as the visit to Pope Francis to Sayyid al-Sistani in Najaf could bridge gaps, so too Al-Hussein could be a builder of bridges between two great families.
We have a question from Sheikh Muhammad Al-Hili. He's saying, congratulations on this new book, Father Christopher. I remember speaking to Father Christopher after the Woolf Institute event on how he will tackle the subject of Karbalā. And my question is, which story within the epic of Karbalā did he find most fascinating?
Well, that's a difficult question too. I'm unashamedly devoted to Lady Zainab on the field of Karbalā, because she plays this heroic role 3 times, intervening in the thick of battle, either to try and preserve a life, or to mourn over a life, or to challenge those who were killing her brother. And therefore, because her particular presence at Karbalā, I mean, her psychological development, if you like, pre, during, and then post Karbalā, there's that marvelous description in Ibn Sa'd in one of his works, in which he describes her as coming onto the field like the sun rising. Whereas the night before, she'd been weeping and fainting with horror at the sound of an approaching army. Her psychological development and her courage on the field of battle, proving that courage is not a male virtue, it is a human virtue. And she and some of the other members of the family practiced it equally. For me, that's the most captivating thing in a captivating story. It's hard to pinpoint. However, I have to say that these dream texts grow very emotional when one begins to feel and sense and even smell the texture of the field of Karbalā, and hear the hurried rushing between heaven and earth of Gibril. At times he's impatient to get his message across, and he races between heaven and earth to repeat the same message. These two are very moving and emotional stories, less told perhaps than the story of Zainab. So it's an impossible question. I like the whole story with little bits in between.
We have a question from Parmia Babaikia. I hope I'm not completely mangling this. Thank you so much for your interesting talk. Could you also speak to the Mahdi, the hidden imams of Shia, in relation to this topic you just talked about? Any particular distinctions or interesting theological points you can share with us regarding encountering the hidden imam, angelology, dreams, and so on?
This is not a particular area that I've researched, either the hidden imam or his hiddenness or his his return. Obviously, from the Christian point of view, there are great parallels between the return of Al-Mahdi and the return of Jesus and the restoration of justice. But besides a number of elements in terms of his birth, his Christian mother, it's not a subject that I know particularly well enough to be able to answer that question in any way. I mean, it's a subject that I would need to look at. The question of dreams, of course, penetrates the whole of the history of Shia Islam. It's not just around Karbalā that there are dreams. There are lots of other dreams of Al-Hussein, of the Prophet, lots of other visitations by angels, and certainly I'm sure Al-Mahdi is one of these, but that's not an area that I know well enough to answer the question sufficiently.
We have another question. Professor Clohessy described how these dreams are so concrete and vivid, not enigmatic by comparison with ancient Christian and Jewish dream literature. Does this characterize Islamic dream literature in general, or Kabbalah in particular? And what comparative conclusions do we draw from this?
No, in this text of mine, some of the dreams are very enigmatic. So the dream books begins with a dream by Suleiman, in which he is confused by what he sees. It's not a bad dream, he's just a bit confused by it, and he has to have Al-Hasan al-Basri explain it. The dreams of al-Fadl, a famous dream in which she says to the Prophet, I found a piece of you in my lap. And she's horrified. It's an horrific dream. And the Prophet reinterprets the dream in a very positive way. No, he says, you will wean Al-Hussein. But in fact, in reality, the dream is horrendous because it has to do with body parts. And so perhaps the Prophet's reinterpretation is simply to calm al-Fadl. Ayman also has the same dream. So some of the dreams are very difficult to understand. Fatima has a dream while she's pregnant with Hussein that she frightens her terribly and she rushes to her father. In fact, she has more than one dream. She also has a dream about the death of both of her sons and has to have these explained by the Prophet, so that Muhammad himself challenges the dream. He commands the dream to appear before him and says, why have you done this? And the dream says, oh, just to frighten her. And he's able to say to his daughter, there's nothing in this, there's nothing to fear. Later on, the dreams of Karbalā, that is of the dust, of the messages, and some of these dreams are visions of angels, of the angel talking, are much easier to understand. They don't need complex explanation. Dreams traditionally in Christianity, there are these two types, I suppose, certainly in Christian scriptures, and most of them are quite understandable because they are almost always predictive of a great birth. In fact, even in the Jewish scriptures, most of the dreams predict a great future event. They may not always be understandable to those receiving them, but so that Mary, in the visit of the angel, which I kind of include among these dreams, she asks a number of questions because she doesn't understand them. So interpretation is needed. But at the center of this book are dreams that are quite clear in their meaning, that there is going to be a death, or that it's happened already because the Prophet then appears in dreams after the Karbalā, and they don't need any deciphering. There are a number of traditions in the Sunni books of Hadith in which Muhammad himself invites his companions, if any of you had a dream last night, come and tell me, and I will interpret for you. He becomes the prime interpreter of dreams. In this, if you like, he steps into the shoes of Yusuf as the great interpreter of mysterious dreams. And many of the dreams recounted in Hadith are confusing dreams of people drinking lots of milk and all kinds of others that I've recounted in the book. And the Prophet then reinterprets the meaning. But the dreams of Karbalā need little interpretation. They are absolutely clear in their meaning.
We're drawing to a close now. Again, let me use this opportunity to show this beautiful book. There's actually a really lovely rainbow outside my window, which somehow is very fitting as well. There's a last little question, which I'm going to read to you, Father Clohessy. It was lovely listening to you speak so passionately. Do you have any plans to record this as an audiobook? Are there any plans? Gemma from Gorgias and Father Clohessy. Audiobook, will we see this?
Well, this would be a first for Gorgias. I don't know about you, Christopher, but we can certainly look into it. That would be very exciting.
All right. So we'll wrap up now. Thank you so much, Father Clohessy, for talking to us. Thank you very much for all the panelists who were here to introduce Father Clohessy. Thank you very much to the audience for asking your very interesting questions. I do apologize to those of you who asked questions who we couldn't get through in the time that we have. But we are certainly going to read the questions and Father Clohessy will have a look at them. I hope we'll see you at our next event, perhaps in the next shared event with Hikmah, when we have Abbas Hassan here talking about another book launch. And I hope you all have a good evening and stay safe. Bye-bye, everyone.